Hello, I'm Mishka, and this channel is the Helsinki Renaissance, where we will be talking about arts and culture, and hopefully the most Renaissance man-like manner in which arts and culture may be discussed, so please stay tuned for that. Now, I thought that I'd make a quick video around the culture of the fan reaction to Game of Thrones Season 8, because it seems like there is a certain kind of a trend forming in Hollywood, where if there is some sort of an age-old attitude of the customer is always right in certain areas of business. It seems like Hollywood is bravely subverting the fans' expectation by taking the opposite stance, that it's as if the customer is always wrong when it comes to the customer's attitude towards American media and arts and entertainment related companies. And more precisely, I mean, there have been a fair amount of these kinds of public disagreements between some fans and the creators of certain kind of products, which obviously social media is enabling to happen in a very public manner. But I just feel like, I mean, I don't want to take any sides particularly with any of these situations, but because I saw two different Kit Harington interviews with Kit Harington, who was an actor on Game of Thrones, and in the first interview, he referred to Season 8. If he had to describe it with one word, he said that it was disappointing. And now in a later interview, when other people as well have faced their disappointment, Kit Harington has ostensibly done some sort of an about face when it comes to the reaction to how Game of Thrones ended, and he said that he started to feel very defensive about the show and about the people who made the show, basically saying that he doesn't like the narrative, that the reason why the show was rushed to the ending was because people wanted to have their careers in other projects. And basically this kind of idea that some fans were accusing the cast and crew of some kind of hackery and indifference and so on. And, you know, Kit Harington said that everyone he knows on the show, you know, cares as deeply about that project as anyone else, and that you know, he now feels like telling the critics to go F themselves if they don't like how the show ended, and so on. And you know, there is some kind of a pile on happening right now where everyone feels like voicing completely, you know, just all of the disappointments that the fans are having right now. You know, they are being given a massive spotlight right now because the Season 8 just ended, and it's you know, current affairs right now. But to me it seems like some people are kind of missing the whole point about why it is that the fans are reacting as they are, and because some people seem to be able to miss the obvious, I thought that I could make a quick video explaining what the kind of structure to the fan position is. So basically, if the most comparable predecessor to the Game of Thrones success story would be the Lord of the Rings movies that Peter Jackson released in the early 2000s. We can look at the success of the Lord of the Rings and then contrast that to some of the lack of success that some of the latter Game of Thrones seasons received, and look at how those differ and how it is that fans acted one way towards Lord of the Rings and another way towards Game of Thrones. Because again, this is fairly simple stuff, but apparently some people just aren't particularly thinking about it right now. And because the fan reaction is so obvious, borderline inevitable, it's just gonna happen again and again and again in the future if people ignore certain basic market realities around this kind of a situation. So anyway, I'm sure everyone can agree that Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings was quite a successful adaptation of a literary classic. And both fans of the Tolkien books and people who had never read them alike appreciated them to a fair amount. But that it was both a commercial success and what the French call succès d'estime, and that those movies have aged rather well, and they are still seen as some kind of a gold standard in how to successfully do adaptations of high fantasy, source material from another medium into either cinema or television. And basically, I'd say that the formula for success for Lord of the Rings is pretty straightforward, and I would argue that Game of Thrones fans wanted exactly that, and they were disappointed because they didn't get exactly that. So basically, I would say that when somebody gives the green light to a project that is an adaptation of either a bestseller or a classic novel, what they want is to have a core audience for the adaptation that consists of people who are already fans of the source material. So, when Hollywood does adaptations, you could say that they are outsourcing development of stories to other industries. And that's one level to it, in that some of the novels, comic books, TV shows, whatever, they can function a bit like spec scripts, so that Hollywood can spot a story they like and request from whoever owns the rights to that whether they can do an adaptation or not. So there is kind of a spec script level to adaptations, but I would argue that the biggest level to why Hollywood is so happy to do remakes and adaptations of novels and whatever is because Hollywood is perceiving that there is a certain kind of built-in marketing that's already done to a work that has some kind of a fan base in other medium. So Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was a very successful book series with fans globally, and as such it's a safer investment for whoever's giving the money to Peter Jackson for a project that already has lots of fans than if you're doing a movie like EVAAH with Brendan Fraser that doesn't have any comparable core fan base somehow built into it. So EVAAH was quite a flop when it was made. It couldn't at all capitalize on whatever kind of post-Lord of the Rings, demand for high fantasy blockbuster cinema. So, EVAAH's failure, you could say that you could criticize how it is that the film was made, but it certainly didn't help it that there wasn't a built-in fan base from it being some sort of a global success story as a literary event, as far as its source story would be concerned. So basically, seeking to share, let's say, the novelist fan base is a key reason why Hollywood is so happy to do remakes and other adaptations. So just to give itself kind of a position on the third base as far as marketing is concerned is, I would argue, the major reason why Hollywood is doing adaptation. Now, the flip side to that position, where you give yourself a more prominent market position through doing an adaptation of an already successful property, is that you need to appease the fans who already have very in-depth views about what the project should be. And that I would argue that it's implicitly understood and accepted that if you do an adaptation, you will be judged based on whether you can do a rough market equivalent of the property in a given medium. So that if somebody does an opera about a Franz Kafka novel or novella, it's implicitly understood that if there's something Kafkaesque about the aesthetic of Kafka novels, the people who would be interested parties to watch that opera will judge it as either a success or a failure based on whether it can partake in the aesthetic tendencies established in the original work. So that if you are making a wholly original opera, it can theoretically be anything and go about its business any way that the artist sees fit. But an adaptation is a bit different in that because you are partaking in fans of the source property, they think that you owe it to the source property to partake in some of the aesthetic tendencies of the source. And if you don't, those fans will turn against you and say that you failed with the adaptation. So basically, that is how audiences have acted in the past, and there's no reason to think that the audience won't keep acting like that from here to eternity. So it's just how fans act, and it's just a market reality around the situation. So the reason why Lord of the Rings by Peter Jackson and New Line Cinema was such a grand success on so many different levels was because the audiences accepted and agreed on the kind of idea that the Lord of the Rings movies would be the cinematic market equivalent to what Lord of the Rings books are to literature. That kind of successful translation of the kind of aesthetic core of the book to the new medium, that was as if as smooth as it could have possibly been expected to be. The fans of the original aesthetic were there to applaud the successful translation of that aesthetic to the new medium. Now, that's not to say that you cannot make any kind of changes. For instance, the Arwen character played by Liv Tyler, she's not in the original books. There were some plot strands cut from the original books, and certain kind of other changes were happening, and fans were just fine with it, because to be a rough market equivalent doesn't mean that you need to do a photocopy. That doesn't mean that you cannot have any of your personal input. That doesn't mean that you cannot move things around, as far as there's an understanding that what made a given aesthetic property successful in one area, that the kind of heart of that aesthetic is also the raison d'etre of why the story is told again. So it's not that you need to be somehow completely shackled by the storytelling of the original property, but you need to do things for the right reasons, for the kind of reasons that are according to the characteristic of the property that you are doing. And basically, I would say that it was implicit when New Line Cinema started marketing Lord of the Rings to both general audiences and fans of the Tolkien books. It was implicit that for the marketing to be truthful, they needed to carry on with the aesthetic tradition of the source novel. And if they would have failed on it, if Lord of the Rings movies would have had like the aesthetic trends of, I don't know, Danny DeVito's Throw Your Mama off the train or something, there would have been a fan backlash because they would have thought that the marketing misled them. That it was implicitly understood that the raison d'etre for the project was to redo the aesthetic in new surroundings. If the marketing promised that, but the film didn't deliver, the fans would have been disappointed. But because the films delivered on it, the fans loved the project. So let's now turn to the Game of Thrones. Now, some of the people who have watched Japanese anime are already very well aware, unfortunately, of the concept of what happens when an anime based on a successful manga catches up with the source material and then is faced on the dilemma of whether they wait for the original to continue or whether they will just start improvising forward. And because this is a business where people are trying to make profit so that they could be professionally employed, people usually choose to start improvising material. And it just happens to be a bit of a trend with anime that whenever the showrunners who didn't create the aesthetic of the original, who are just borrowing somebody else's aesthetic, when they need to start making up their own decisions, it seems like the quality drops off the cliff. Because the kind of implicit pact that the cast and crew have with the fans is that they are there redoing the aesthetic of the source material. When they, for whatever reason, fail to keep redoing it, that's when the fan backlash happens. And you know, there's a famous example of an anime called Full Metal Alchemist, where the fans despised the ending that the showrunners had decided for them when they had caught up with the manga original. That the fan backlash for the first Full Metal Alchemist show became so toxic, the fans just so burnt the bridge to that project that they needed to redo the entire series a second time, which was titled Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and then they ended it the right way, finishing the aesthetic that the manga original property started, and then fans showed their appreciation for Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood because that was the show that they always wanted, and they act like the first version didn't even exist. And basically, I think that Game of Thrones is in that kind of a situation, in that it's unfortunate that they ran out of the source novels and they needed to start improvising their own way of finishing the show. Now, I don't know, and I don't think very many people know, to what an extent George R.R. Martin gave the showrunners of Game of Thrones the kind of outlines of the ending. I don't know how large the overlap is with what will be the ending of the books, but even if the events will be roughly equivalent, it's still seen that there is a certain kind of aesthetic shift that happens when the show went on its own and isn't just following on the tracks laid by the books. In that that is the whole point of the fan backlash, in that people became Game of Thrones fans not because they were fans of the individuals of the showrunners, not because they were fans of the individuals in the cast and crew. A lot of the people became fans of the high fantasy established by George R.R. Martin. Now, the production values to HBO's Game of Thrones were sensational. I mean, several segments are as good looking as any TV show has ever been. The cast and crew is across the board, top rate, in that a lot of the actors are, again, giving as good a performance as basically any actor has ever given on TV show, in that there is a lot of quality to Game of Thrones. But basically, the production values, it is a bit like the icing on the cake. And the George R.R. Martin high fantasy saga, that is the cake, as it were. And what a lot of the kind of bigger fans of the Game of Thrones, they are there just to get the George R.R. Martin story. What they want is the aesthetic line that George R.R. Martin is establishing, and if they don't get that aesthetic line that Game of Thrones Season 1, Season 2, Season 3, Season 4 are perceived to have, when the show does departures that cause the overlap between the George R.R. Martin aesthetic and the HBO show aesthetic, when they cause that overlap to diminish, that's when the fan backlash starts heating up. And when somebody like Kit Harington says that he doesn't want to be harsh on any of the fans critical of the show, but he still gets this kind of knee-jerk reaction of, how dare you imply that we don't care, like we lived and breathed that show for several years. Of course we care, like it was a huge part of our lives for a big chunk of that 2011-2019 situation. Now, I'm not personally implying that the cast and crew doesn't care. I don't know any of them personally. I don't know the showrunners personally. I cannot speculate on whether they care. But, if there is a saying of somebody being ready, willing, and able, like, if the whole point of Game of Thrones was for HBO to create a market equivalent of George R.R. Martin's high fantasy, I'm sure they were ready to do it. I'm sure a lot of people were willing to do it. But when they didn't have the source novels to use as a crutch to get forward with the show, were they able to keep bringing the audience something that had as high as possible an overlap with the George R.R. Martin aesthetic? The argument against the showrunners of Game of Thrones is that they may have been ready to do it, they may have been willing to do it, they just weren't able to do it. And it's not saying that they were, somehow bad actors or something. It's just they should have, one way or another, found a way to get George R.R. Martin more involved in the situation. And a lot of the arguments for, hackery that upset some of the actors in Game of Thrones, a lot of the arguments is saying that the reason why they didn't, do all in their power to get George R. Martin involved in the project is because they only cared so much. It was just a job. It wasn't some sort of the biggest passion project of their lives. They were just there to do a job and they wanted to do it well, but it wasn't somehow like a personal passion for very many people on set to do as much justice as humanly possible to the original aesthetic line in the George R. Martin novels. And that's at the crux of the criticism, is that the reason why fans feel betrayed is because the show was giving them a market equivalent of the source novel for so many seasons that there was an implicit understanding that for the show to keep being a success story, they need to keep doing that kind of aesthetic. And if there was a perception that there was a clear departure from that aesthetic from season 6 to season 7 to season 8, the more it went on, the more it just started drifting away from the kind of core of the source material. That's why there's a fan backlash. And, I don't think that somebody like Quentin Tarantino can direct like Stanley Kubrick. Now, if I say that, it's not exactly criticizing Quentin Tarantino, in that Tarantino has his own aesthetic and he's not particularly obliged to have Stanley Kubrick aesthetic traditions. Kubrick's kind of more coldly analytical and schematic, and Tarantino is a bit more vivacious with his filmmaking, in that they're just going in different directions. And, if Quentin Tarantino would somehow be mortally wounded by me saying that I don't think that Tarantino can just direct in the specific manner of Stanley Kubrick, like I feel like that would be analogous to some of the Game of Thrones cast and crew or showrunners being offended by saying that they couldn't successfully do the George R. Martin aesthetic consistently throughout the running of the show. Like, it's not saying that they lack any talents. It's not saying that they aren't good people with their heart in the right place. It's just that they cannot naturally, organically move forward with the same kind of aesthetic tendencies that George R. Martin is moving things forward. That's the entirety of the criticism. So, again, you can like Stanley Kubrick movies, you can like Quentin Tarantino movies, you can like them both, you can like both, you can dislike both, or you can just like one. But it's not like saying that one person is less talented than the other because they cannot be the kind of chameleon that, somehow perfectly keeps doing the work of the other. It's just that, you cannot advertise a Quentin Tarantino film as the next Stanley Kubrick film if that genuinely isn't the kind of aesthetic that the audience is getting. And that kind of perceived duping the audience into, being told that, you're a fan of Game of Thrones because you like the George R. Martin aesthetic. Well, since you're gonna keep getting it with these final seasons, whereas it wasn't what they were getting, and that kind of false advertisement that the fans perceived that they were having, that's at the heart of the backlash. But anyway, I don't know whether I should speak more broadly about this kind of line of Hollywood hatching up some sort of union with some of the old media, new media, and trying to tell the fans that the customer is always wrong when the customer is being critical of what American media or American arts and entertainments are doing. I don't know whether I should talk about it anymore. I mean, it's a bit silly to witness because, in American sports, they know fully well that the fans are, as it were, undefeated, in that if the fans don't like something, it's kind of tilting at the windmills if somebody like James Dolan or whoever just tries to institute some sort of an official story that something that everyone else treats as unsuccessful, that they insist is perfect success and perfectly acceptable and whatever, and that the fans act the way that they are. The fans act the way that they act, and the fans are undefeated after a fashion. In that I saw some people call Game of Thrones fans entitled, and I suppose they technically are, but the word entitled has gotten some negative connotations in that, if you go to a la carte restaurant, you think that you are entitled to certain level of service. If you, if you go to if you take a taxi, you think that you are entitled to a sober driver. If you buy something from the grocery store, you think that you are entitled to a product that hasn't expired yet, and so on. So, there are these kind of neutral ways of using the word entitled that doesn't really paint somebody as a bad person, but there's also ways of using the word entitled to imply negative connotations, as if somebody's being unreasonable or somebody's somehow doing like crimes against being genteel or something. But like, I would say that yes, Game of Thrones fans are entitled, but isn't that kind of at the heartlands of the customer service industry, in that if one service provider does things badly and drives customers away, they will be out of a business eventually. In that, catering to the fans is kind of, in the selfish self-preservation interest in a lot of the businesses. So, because businesses are kind of customer reliant, that's why the fans assume that they are entitled to certain things, and basically it is kind of a quixotic bit of tilting at the windmills, trying to get customers not be entitled. In that I feel like I feel like there is a negative sense of entitlement where some fans feel like they get to dictate everything about a given process, and some fans act as if they should be allowed to be like co-authors or something, and then artists and whatever start rolling their eyes and start saying that that's not how it works. So I would say that the kind of neutral, non-problematic fan entitlement is where fans act like, as long as you aren't falsely advertising something and you deliver on what is implicitly promised in the kind of transaction from service providers to customers. As long as you aren't falsely advertising and you're delivering on what you're promising, I feel like fans feel like they are entitled to that. And as long as that is as it should be, you know, that's a good common ground to the kind of marketplace. And from that kind of landscape, I feel like the fans are perfectly justified in some of the criticism against Game of Thrones. And it's not meant to be personal, it's just pointing out that, you know, certain mistakes were made and they were in somewhat critical spots. But anyway, I just felt like pointing that out to whomever it may concern. But anyway, that's about it for this video. I thank you for watching, and bye bye for now.